Copies of the book can be purchased from Bookie's Bookstore on 10324 Southwestern Avenue, bookiesbookstores.com. So they're signed, so go ahead and order them. Kathleen and Keith met and he signed them all. Kathleen Rooney is the founding editor of Rose Metal Press, a nonprofit publisher of literary work in hybrid genres, as well as a founding member of Poems While You Wait, a team of poets and their typewriters who compose commissioned poetry on demand. She teaches in the English department at DePaul University. Let's welcome Kathleen Rooney, author of Cher and Major Whittlesey and William Boxfish Takes a Walk. Welcome to Evergreen Park.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to the book club for having me. Thanks to the library. And also, again, just to echo Julie's shout out to Bookies. They are a wonderful independent bookstore. And I just want to specifically say, Keith was amazing. They're down far from where I am. I'm up in Edgewater on the far north side. And Keith volunteered to come all the way up from down in Beverly and bring the books. And we did, an outdoor socially distant signing. He brought them to my doorstep and I signed them. So I just think that is a good bookseller. That is a great bookstore owner, and so much gratitude to him for all his hard work. And so kind of how this evening will work is, I think, Julie described it, but just for the part that you're about to hear, my book, of course, is Cher and Major Whittlesey. And I think some people have read it, but possibly some people haven't, but this presentation will, I think, have something for everyone. And so I'm gonna a question that I get asked a lot is, and I think any author gets asked a lot, is how did you come up with your ideas? Or how did you decide to write this book? Or why did you pick this topic? And I love that question because I think there's so many ways to answer it. And so I'm gonna do a PowerPoint that gives the history behind the real life figures, but that also kind of answers why I chose to take these real life figures and make them into a fiction novel. So I think, the thing that you need to know, whether you've read it or not, just to recap, it's, kind of the pitch is in the title. It's about Cher, who's a pigeon, as you can see, based on a real life pigeon, a hero of World War I, and Major Whittlesey, who was a soldier. And they came, to intersect each other's lives in October of 1918. And I'll get into exactly how, but I think the big thing to know is that pigeons in World War I were one of the best forms of communication, and that's what led these two, I'm going to call them people. I think we can extend personhood to animals. I think anyone who's an animal lover knows, you consider your cat a person, your dog a person. I consider pigeons people. So these two people, that's how they came to be together. So for now, again, as Julie said, I'm going to kind of do my PowerPoint, but if questions occur to you as I go, put them in the chat. I won't stop and answer them, but I don't know, for me, when I'm listening, if I don't write my question down, I'll forget it at the end. So if that's you, just put it in the chat and we'll hopefully come back and scoop it up after the presentation. So here we go. Thank you all so much for being here. All right, so here is my slideshow. Welcome to my PowerPoint. So the title of this talk, as you can see, is Above the Trenches and in Them, the Real Life Pigeon and Soldier Who Inspired Cher and Major Whittlesey. And you can see here right on the first slide, there's photos of both of them. World War I was a long time ago. It was over 100 years ago now, but we had technology such that we can actually see these figures, unlike in some other historical events. And so that was helpful to me as a novelist. And I thought you would find it interesting to sort of see the both of them as well. And so to kind of, talk about the inspiration and then, get into the history, I think there's all kinds of metaphors you could use for inspiration. And I hesitate to just call inspiration because it sounds a little outside the artist's control, or like something that comes, a bolt out of the blue. And I think sometimes it is a bit of that, but I think often it comes from something that's already inside the person. And so for me, the ability to write this book kind of came from a combination of an inspiration from outside, but something that already kind of obsessed or fascinated me. So ever since I was a little kid, I've been fascinated with World War I. And, you can see the numbers here, and I'll, just go through them quickly. just the scope of it boggled my mind. The fact that the casualties were over 40 million, and honestly, probably more, there were probably more that they just didn't record, but that's 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. And then within that, you had about 9.7 million of those dead being military personnel combined from, all theaters, and then 10 million civilians. So it really was a world war. It really was a great, as in massive, war. And something about that, and then also about how they fought it, haunted me. The way that they fought, the way that, if you've studied World War I, you've heard this is not original to me, but just the fact that they had these kind of like old school ideals and old school tactics of, honor and duty and cavalry charges, combined with new technology like tanks and barbed wire and machine guns and poison gas. So just something about that, I couldn't get it out of my head once I learned it was a thing that really happened. And, if you're wondering, like, what a morbid child, like, why would a little kid be fascinated by the Great War? And it's because my dad was in the military, and he, as part of his service, would sometimes teach classes. So he taught classes on military history and tactics and strategy. And he was kind of more of a Civil War guy. I think, once you start studying this stuff, you do find, I don't want to call it a favorite war, but you find a conflict that, rises above the others in terms of how it holds your interest. And so he kind of liked the Civil War, and I, for whatever reason, just was gravitating toward World War I. And so I kind of learned about it from that, but then also you can see these two pictures, and I don't know, bonus points if you're also a fan of what I'm about to say, but on the left you have this show, this short-lived TV show called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which, when I say short-lived, I mean short-lived. It was 92 to 93, and I was just in the right, like, tween age where it was just like catnip to me. It was a great show, I thought, and one of the things they did well was depict World War I. I think they did, unlike much media, a good job of showing the futility of war. You have, Indiana Jones, who joins with all these ideas of glory and valor, and he very quickly realizes that this conflict is not going to be like that. And then, from a more highbrow angle, I don't think, I'm not like a guilty pleasures person. I think if you like it and get something out of it, great. But I will admit that, the poetry of Wilfred Owen might be slightly more elevated than this TV show. But I loved the poetry of World War I. And I'm a poet, as Julie mentioned, I do poems on demand and write my own poetry. So I became, it's not a poetry reading, I won't read this, but I will tell you, go read it on your own. But I became fascinated with this generation of men who fought in the war, but who also memorialized it in literature. And this here is my favorite World War I poem. It's Rain by Edward Thomas. And I think you can even just see, I put this here, but you see this all the time in the anthologies that have these guys where you get their birth date and you kind of see they're all born around the same-ish time. And then you see their death dates and you can see they also died around the same-ish time. And it's because they were killed in these battles where just like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of men just died. And so Edward Thomas died in 1917 in the Battle of Arras, along with countless other men. And I think that's part of why I began to, at an early age, think, man, I would love to write a World War I novel someday if I could find a way to write about it that I haven't seen done a million times before. And then one more sort of like personal connection before I shift to the pigeon side of things. This is the American Legion Post in Downers Grove, Illinois, not too far from where any of us are in Chicago or Evergreen Park. But my dad was and is in the American Legion, and it's named after this guy that you see on the right, Alexander Bradley Burns. And he went to my high school, Downers Grove North, go Trojans. And every time you walked in, you saw this picture. He's above sort of the entryway. And so, when I saw that as like a high schooler, I felt very moved by the fact that he died not long after he was the age I was then, right? He graduated high school and enlisted And he, as it says here, made the supreme sacrifice, and he was killed by shrapnel on March 12th, 1918. And so that, you know, he's just somebody I thought about a lot. But then to go with this, so that's like the first thing that was in me, right? Like kind of the firewood that was waiting for the spark. I love birds. I think birds are awesome. Obviously, a lot of people do. Bird watching has been really having a moment during the pandemic. And specifically, I really like pigeons. And I am aware that pigeons are not beloved by everyone. They're a much maligned creature, but I think they're remarkable. I won't go on and on. I became kind of like a crazy pigeon lady doing research for this book, but I'll save it for the Q&A maybe. But, you know, here's the famous scene from Mary Poppins where they, you know, take the Banks children down into London and they meet the bird lady who sings "Tuppence a bag, feed the birds." And I thought, I don't know, there's something cool about pigeons because if you see them, you know you're in a city. And I grew up in the suburbs and I'm glad that I did because I realized my parents were trying to give me educational and other opportunities, but I always wanted to live in the city and now I do. And, you know, anytime I see pigeons anywhere, I know that like an urban landscape is close or I'm in it. And this is me with some friends hanging out in Daly Plaza. My sister's a photographer, and so she took this picture of me hanging out with my feathered pals. So those are the two things that were kind of already in my mind. And then I teach at DePaul University, and I teach this class called Drift and Dream, Writer as Urban Walker. And I have also written the novel Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. So I don't teach my own work in my class, but I teach a lot of other writers who've written about walking. And in that workshop back in 2013, my student Brian Michich, who I always give credit to, turned in this poem. And it had this kind of throwaway line. And it was, the image was like this old guy sitting on a park bench, surrounded by pigeons. And then he said, "This was no Cher Ami story. Look it up." And I did, because I always tell my students to look stuff up. I'm forever, you know, if they run into an illusion and they don't look it up, I'm like, why didn't you look it up? You have your phone, you have the whole internet, like there's no reason not to know something. So I looked it up. And I was amazed. And so this is where I learned the, you know, the true story that eventually after, you know, many years became this book. So I learned that there was this incident in World War I called the Lost Battalion. And this was 554 soldiers who were led by my guy, Major Whittlesey. And in October of 1918, they kind of became the victims of their own success. So this was during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And this was, you know, as you can tell by the date, one of the final pushes on the part of the Allies, including the Americans, to just like end the bloodletting, to end the war. And so the plan was that everyone all up and down this line was just going to advance on the Germans and just defeat them. And they knew it was going to be bloody and hard, but it was like advance till the last man drops. You know, they were like, no first aid, just go. And so as a result, Charles Whittlesey and his men and people all up and down the line, they didn't bring the normal supplies. They didn't even bring their overcoats. They didn't bring rations, because the idea was they were just going to push through everyone and then set up supply lines and win. But, you know, war being war, it didn't go as it was planned. And so Whittlesey's group was the only one up and down the whole line who made it through. Everyone else retreated, everyone else fell back. So he succeeded, he obtained his objective, but it became awful. So for 4 days, they held out behind German lines. And it was this thing called the pocket, because they kind of became, you know, you have salients in war, which like push out. And so they kind of bubbled off to become their own little circle and just got surrounded. And if that weren't enough, as you can see, on the 5th day, they were the victims of a friendly fire incident. And obviously, like all friendly fire, it was not intentional. The Americans thought that they were providing cover and shelling the Germans, but they were shelling their own people, which was awful. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, pigeons are, one, amazing, and two, really great tools of communication. And so, you know, just to emphasize how difficult communication was during World War I, they had radio, but it was one way. They were very close to getting two-way, but it was still just one way. And they had runners, actual guys who would run messages. And they had, motorcyclists too. Often the messengers would be on motorbikes. And they had telephone, but the technology was so heavy and so analog and super vulnerable. So as you can imagine, both sides were constantly trying to cut the other side's wires to end their communication. And in fact, callback, Alexander Bradley Burns, the American Legion guy, was actually, while he was hanging telephone wires, he was repairing a cut wire, and that's when the shrapnel got him. So communication was very difficult, and pigeons were actually super fast and super reliable. So as you can see, this isn't Cher and me, this is just a picture of what it kind of looked like when you would be putting a messenger pigeon up. She carried this message, and you can see it says here, "We're along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." So you can hear the desperation in Major Whittlesey's voice. So she did it. Cher and me, the other name in the title, flew 25 miles in 25 minutes, and she delivered the note. And thanks to her, 194 men were saved. And that's way less than the 554 who went in. But most people think that if she hadn't carried the message, they all would have died. They would have been completely wiped out. It would have been like a Custer's Last Stand situation, just nobody made it. But she was injured herself. So she was shot through the chest. She lost an eye. She lost her leg. And I think a tragic truth about the war is that just like many men died, so did many animals. Tons of pigeons died, dogs, horses. And normally, if a bird were as wounded as she was, they would have just kind of said, well, casualty of war. But they knew she was so important that they stitched her up. The medics actually saved her life. And then when she was recovering, they made her a little wooden leg. So in some of the pictures, you can see her leg, it's very touching and very moving. And you can see she received a bunch of medals, including the Croix de Guerre. The French have like a longer history of rewarding animals for participation in conflict. America doesn't quite have that as much, but Pershing did arrange to have like a specific medal made just for her because she was so important. And, Whittlesey, of course, was not forgotten. He was highly decorated as well, Medal of Honor, Croix de Guerre, Legion of Honor. And when he came home from the conflict, he was highly in demand as a public speaker. And he, and the book kind of gets into this, he suffered a lot from survivor's guilt, from PTSD, which was very poorly understood back then. And he felt like he couldn't say no to any of these requests. He felt so guilty that he just knocked himself out. And he also became stunningly famous. I think a thing I like to emphasize when I do these talks is, maybe some of you have heard of these people, but even I, as like a World War I buff, was surprised to learn about them. They were so famous in their day, but they're almost totally forgotten now. But the fame was one of the things that started to weigh on Whittlesey once he tried to re-enter civilian life. And he was like the last person you would expect to be a war hero. He went to Williams College in Massachusetts. He was very quiet. He wrote poetry. He was artistic. He loved nature. He went to Harvard for law school. He was a Wall Street lawyer. He had this mind for like details and contracts. He was just a very meticulous, bookish guy. Not that everyone who wears glasses is bookish, but he kind of like fits that bill. And he even appeared in a movie that you can see called The Lost Battalion that came out in 1919. And he was acting as himself, which is just kind of wild to think about, having a post-traumatically stressed person literally go reenact the thing that gave them PTSD. But he did it. And sadly, Cher and me also was kind of made into a mascot. The government and the media kind of really needed heroes because this was such a just devastating conflict with not a lot of opportunity for heroism. They kind of realized that the morale boost that Whittlesey and this adorable pigeon could provide would really help buoy people's spirits and kind of make them feel okay about war. And so Cher and me actually got toured around to injured soldiers to kind of be like an example to them. She got toured around to school children. And as you can imagine, that was not good for her. And she died in June of 1919 in New Jersey, where they had a big pigeon training site. And then, you know, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, I think you'll see this coming, and it's also history, so I didn't make this up. But Whit took his own life in 1921. He booked a ticket on this United Fruit ship because back then, you know, they had ships that shipped. I mean, we still do, as we all know from the Ever Given and the Suez, but these ships were double duty ships where they would bring, you know, fruit up and down, you know, from, you know, the north and south, but they would also take passengers. So you'd be on a cruise ship, very glamorous, but also it might be full of bananas or something. So anyway, he booked a ticket one way to Havana where he had no business and jumped overboard. And, you know, he had lots of reasons that he might be motivated to do this, but people think that it's partly because right before this decision, he had participated in the interment ceremony of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, because that became a thing after World War I, and many people think that just made such an impression. It was kind of the last straw. But he, you know, he being a lawyer left this really meticulous will and left all these letters. And one of the things that had been kind of haunting him is that the Germans asked them to surrender when they were in the pocket, and Whittlesey said no. But it got distorted in the press that he told the Germans to go to hell. And he was just appalled. He was not that kind of person. He would never say that. He didn't have that bravado. He didn't like to swear. And it pained him that he became Charles Go to Hell Whittlesey when really all he did was just not surrender and pull in all the white flags. So he left the surrender letter from the Germans that he had refused to his co-commander, George McMurtry. He was very thoughtful right until the end. Meanwhile, Cher also had kind of a weird death/afterlife. They taxidermied her, and this is a picture that I took when I saw her in the Smithsonian in 2014. And what I think is one of the things that really interested me is that when they were stuffing her, after assuming for her whole life that she was male, and you can tell if you study French, you know, of course, Cher is what you would call a male bird. If it was a female bird, you would add an E at the end of both words. She was a female, but the Smithsonian was like, good enough, we're not going to correct it. So it didn't get corrected until much later. And I don't think it was any kind of conspiracy. I don't think it was any kind of like plot, but I do think it speaks to who people are comfortable considering heroes. I think, you know, you say war hero, you picture mostly a guy. And so I thought it was interesting that Cher was a gal. And then I also thought that it was very interesting that, to me, it seemed pretty clear that Charles Whittlesey was a closeted gay man. And, you know, I can't, like, people often ask, you know, can you prove it? And it's like, almost, but not quite. I mean, he didn't keep a journal. He never wrote, you know, anything that was like an admission. But the papers made so much of the fact that he was a confirmed bachelor, no woman was involved, he never had time for the ladies. It was all this stuff that if you were not aware of queer culture or just didn't want to know, you could have been like, oh, how sad, he never found a lady. But if you were in the know, you would read it and understand like that was a coded way, a euphemistic way to say that he was gay. And that interested me because, as you can see from this recruitment poster, there was an obsession with like red-blooded masculinity during World War I, and this idea that because of urbanization and all these men moving from, you know, physical laborer jobs or rural agriculture jobs that had them out in the sun, getting big muscles and living this wholesome life, supposedly, they were going soft, you know, in these white-collar jobs, moving to the cities, working in offices. And so you even see this in the recruiting poster, which is, you know, enlist, on which side of the window are you? And so outside you have these strapping, sun-bronzed military guys, and then inside you have this sort of like thin, foppish, well-dressed dandy. And so there was absolutely this, this idea of something to prove in terms of gender when it came to war. So I just thought that was interesting. But for those who are curious, I felt like the strongest, you know, mark in my research that indicated that Whittlesey was gay was in the 9 farewell letters that he left in his cabin. One of them was to his law partner, his former law partner, John Bayard Prynne, and it said, just a note to say goodbye. I'm a misfit by nature and by training, and there's an end of it. So, you know, at that point, to declare oneself a misfit in that way was pretty much, that's as close as you're going to get to somebody saying that they were gay. And I just thought it was important to cover that aspect of both characters' lives. I wanted to make two really well-rounded characters, so it seemed like that was definitely something I wanted to put in. And as I wrap up and possibly segue to questions, you know, definitely questions from my interlocutor and then hopefully questions from you. This is Whittlesey's like class portrait, you know, when he was an undergraduate at Williams College. And, you know, I teach college, I teach undergrads. And so it is very moving to me to see him at this age. And in his yearbook, he wrote that the purpose of a college education is learning to judge correctly, to think clearly, and to see and to know the truth, and to attain the faculty of pure delight in the beautiful. And I think that, you know, in the end is where my sorrow and fascination with World War I lies, is all those beautiful humans and animals killed, and for what? You know, at best, there may be like a multiple choice question on a history test, you know, nobody really knows why. So that's why I tried to bring them back into the light and hopefully, you know, teach people and do justice to their memories. And so the book came out in August and it is available at Bookies. So if you are interested, you can email them or call them up. They definitely have signed copies. I thought for a while that I would teach myself how to draw a pigeon, but I'm not that good at drawing. So instead I got a pigeon stamp. So if you buy it, it'll have like a little stamp of a pigeon as well as my signature, if that's enticing. But I will stop sharing my screen now so I can see everyone's faces and we can shift into the Q&A.
Well, on behalf of the Kindred Spirits Book Club and all of the visitors we have tonight, we thank you very much for explaining. All of the members that I have talked to before our meeting were very interested in the book. I have one question I'm going to lead off with, and then I'll open it to others, and I have more. I know that you wrote this book a few years ago, but it happened to come out in the middle of a pandemic. Do you find anything interesting about that juxtaposition?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and that's always the thing, you know, about writing is there's always that delay, you know, when you're writing, when your agent sells it, and then when it comes out, and, you know, you never know what kind of world your book will be released in. And I think the obvious one is that, you know, there was a pandemic in 1918 as well. There was the Spanish flu, and it gets mentioned in the book, and it was certainly a very important thing, and it killed people worldwide, but especially in the military and close quarters. But I think for me, it was kind of less that and more. So the thing that interested me most about Whittlesey is that his heroism is not active. Like, it's not to say he didn't do things, but I think a lot of times we think of, you know, the other World War I hero, Alvin York, who like actively went out and like shot a bunch of Germans. He was a sharpshooter. He was like seeking this pursuit, you know, or people like dash in, you know, bravely to things without caring about their well-being. And what Whittlesey did was passive. He waited. Like, he and his men endured just this sedentary, static, life-threatening situation. And I think the more I read about it and the more I read about how much his men loved him, I think what he was so good at was leadership and just telling them not to give up. Like, so many of them wanted to surrender, even though that almost certainly would have been fatal. There was no guarantee the Germans would have respected them and not killed them. There was no guarantee that it wouldn't have been like a devastating blow to the morale of the army. In fact, it probably would have been. But just through it all, he just got everyone to like stay put and try to stay safe. And I just, you know, you don't want to force a comparison, but just this idea of, you know, trying to protect people, trying to stay put during a pandemic, trying not to make a bad situation worse. I don't know. I found myself even more impressed with him than I was when I wrote it.
Okay. All right. Do we have questions from others?
We did, well, from the chat. You want me to do those? First is, I'm so excited about this discussion. The book was awesome. Love that. I have not read the book yet, but I'm excited to do so. I remember growing up and my grandfather having a pigeon coop above his garage. Someone else said mine too. Oh, Bill Savage was interviewed for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles about Ben's
That's
I-
awesome.
appearance in the series. It was very interesting. Okay.
Should I speak to Helen's
Yeah.
question? Yeah. Yeah. So Helen says it was a little difficult to suspend disbelief that a pigeon dead all those years could be speaking to us and sharing her thoughts. And then, Bill sort of spins it into a question and says, how did you hit on Cherami's voice? And how did you conceive of her ghostliness? I love both of those comments and questions. So Helen, I expected it to be a little difficult and I wanted it to be a bit strange, not off-putting, but I think that was part of, like I said at the beginning, I had wanted to possibly write a World War I book for a while, but I felt like I didn't yet have anything to say that hadn't been said well, either by the men who fought it or by people like Pat Barker, or people like Sebastian Barry, or, on and on, so many great World War I books. But Cherami was the thing that made me think, okay, like, here's my way in. Here's something that hasn't happened in literature yet. And so I think, the pun I always make when I'm talking about this book is she was a way to give a bird's eye view, to like, let us see this thing we think we've seen so much from a new angle. And so as much as I anthropomorphize her, and as much as she is remarkably articulate and remarkably fluent in English for a bird, she has that distance. And I didn't want her to be corny. I didn't want it to be like, me a pigeon, me no understand human war. That would be so dumb. But I did want her to have that kind of like closeness that I think pigeons do have, right? They love us. And to the people who said, their grandparents had coops and stuff, it's very recent that people have hated pigeons. For most of human history, they've been very close. So, as food sources, as pets, as messengers. And so I thought she would be a great voice. And so to speak, Bill, to your question, just this voice that would be intelligible to people because she's been around people and is part of a species that's been around people for centuries. But she still is from this pigeon culture. Pigeons don't make war. Pigeons are known for being very faithful, very loving. They mate for life. They're very kind to their young. And so I thought that kind of clashing of worlds was something that was interesting. And then as far as her ghostliness, I know it's like, I'm asking a lot of readers, like, not only is it going to be halfway from a pigeon, she's a ghost pigeon. But I think, to me, that made sense because taxidermy is so strange. And so I think there's this, she kind of makes a joke early on in the book where she's like, haha, would they have taxidermied Charles Whittlesey? And you can kind of hear that and think like, oh my God, no, of course I guess that guy Jeremy Bentham was taxidermy, but mostly we don't taxidermy humans. That's just in poor taste. That's like, ew. But we taxidermy animals all the time. And so I was kind of like, what if being taxidermy did something to your spirit? What if it kept you in this sort of liminal space where you kind of couldn't leave? And then also, if you did have to be in this situation where for 100 years you're just sitting, what would you think about and what would you want to tell people? So that's how it happened.
From my point, I don't know, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I truly appreciated the beauty of the language that you used. I thought the writing was very lovely. And sometimes when you read novels, the writing is kind of dumbed down, and this wasn't. It was beautifully done. I appreciated that. Thank you for that.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate your appreciation. Other questions?
Anybody else? Yeah.
Okay, I have another question for you. Back to our pigeon. How did you, I learned all sorts of things about pigeons that I never knew before. And you two Northsiders, I grew up in Lakeview. And the man next door, he didn't have a coop, but he would feed the pigeons. And so they would be down every morning. And we always thought they talked to each other. So this didn't surprise me quite as much as I thought it would. But how did you research or find out all of these things about pigeons?
Great question. So, I write historical fiction often, not exclusively, but a good piece of advice I got about how to do research for historical fiction is to not just read about the time period, but to read within the time period. So I tried to read, broadly, both in history and in pigeons, stuff from now, stuff from like the 21st century on like, if you wanted to keep pigeons now, like, what would you do? Because people do, or like, what do we think about World War I now? But more than that, I tried to go back and sort of see, there's a character, Bill Kavanaugh, who is the pigeon handler for the Lost Battalion. And I knew I wanted to make him like a great pigeon handler, someone who just really understood and loved his birds. And so I asked myself, okay, if Bill is this old and if he's from this place, like what books would Bill Kavanaugh have read about pigeons? And so I got those books and I read them. And what's great is like what was true about pigeons in like 1912 is still true about pigeons, right? They kind of have this essential character. So, I was able to learn all these different things. Like I won't go on and on, but my favorite thing is how pigeons co-parent. And this also kind of ties to, so you can see behind me, that's my kitchen. I'm in my dining room. And so we're on the 3rd floor of a condo, and up there in the eaves, while I was writing this, a pigeon couple moved in. And I had read all the stuff about how they're great, co-parents, and how the mom pigeon and the dad pigeon take turns incubating the eggs, right? They build a nest, they lay 2 eggs. Like the mom usually sits, they split the shifts, like one sits in the daytime and then one sits in the nighttime so the other one can go, eat and drink and do what they have to do. And then when the pigeons are born, they both can feed them. They make pigeon milk, and they're not mammals. It's not milk like mammals make. It's the stuff they make in their throats and their crops, but it's food that feeds the baby pigeons. So both the dad and the mom feed them. And I read this and I was like, that's so beautiful and it's so utopian and humans could learn a lot from that. And I was like, but is it real? And then these pigeons showed up and they were like, oh yeah, it's real. And I got to see them do this.
Wow.
And they raised 2 babies and we gave them goofy names. It's in the author's note, but Walter Pigeon and Coup d'etat, and their babies Molly Wingfold and Feather Locklear. so yeah.
Okay, you have some questions in the chat. One said and this is from Helen again. Do you see yourself doing a follow-up book after the war, or a different war, another form of history?
Yeah, I think, I don't think I would do a sequel of this because, both of my main characters are pretty solidly dead. But I do really like this time period. And so I am, very, very different book, very different tonally. A book that I'm working on now and that I just sent to my agent and she gave me edits, so hopefully it's eventually going to come out, is about Colleen Moore, the silent movie star. I don't know if anybody knows her. She used to be very famous, and she's the one who built the fairy castle that's at the Museum of Science.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was a very famous screen comedian, and almost nobody watches her movies today, but I love her. So I am returning to that kind of, 1910s to 1930s time period. So it'll be a very different book. And then I also see that Helen adds that my descriptions of the way that the men in this were killed were horrible, and that you were moved to tears. And I don't want to be mean, and I don't want to say like good, and I don't want people to cry, but I did in a way. Like, I think one of the things I wanted to do with this book, so I think that so often media, be it literature or film or TV about war, will claim to be anti-war. And I don't think they're lying. I don't think they mean to trick us, but I think they really think they are. But then you watch it and they kind of glorify war, or it looks fun. I love the memoir Jarhead about the Gulf War, but I think at the end of the day, Anthony Swofford makes it seem kind of fun, like horrible, but kind of like a video game. Or like Apocalypse Now, which Coppola says is anti-war, but you watch the scene where they're like in helicopters and they're surfing and it's playing Ride of the Valkyries. It seems kind of cool. And I don't like that. I think war is awful. I think it's horrible that these men were killed like this. And I think it's horrible that these animals were killed like this. And so I didn't want to be graphic for graphic's sake, but I wanted it to be impossible for anyone to get to the end of this book and not know that I think violence is awful. So
kind of building on that, your depiction of the men after the war, obviously Whittlesey, you know, had a terrible time because he felt so guilty and he felt that he was being, you know, he really wasn't the hero that people thought. But when he described many of the others, they felt the same way. Do you feel that that's a true statement, or is that why you presented it that way, or?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that it's an extension of kind of the violence of the war as it's happening. I think we're given to understand, even as increasingly evidence mounts to the contrary, like we want, you know, the government and the media want us to think like, okay, the war is over, and if you survive, you'll eventually be fine. You know, you'll come back and you'll live your life, and the war will be over there and you'll be over here and you'll be fine. But of course we know that's not true. And I think as I was writing, I just kept thinking of like, nobody wins a war. And, you know, the only way not to come home injured is just like not to go. And so I think that was one of the things, because, you know, World War I was one of the first wars where people really, really started talking about it. It's not that people were never PTSD before, there just wasn't a name, but, you know, shell shock kind of, that was the first time it was really applied. And so I think that was one of the things that I wanted to show, is that even if you escape with your life, you might not have escaped. And, you know, one of the things that struck me too was that when Whittlesey disappeared, you know, into the ocean, they interviewed a lot of his friends, because the thing is, like, they were from New York, and New York was then, and, you know, kind of continues to be, like a huge media center. So if you were from New York, you got covered to high heaven. And so all the papers wanted comments from, you know, his friend Marguerite, from John Bayard Prynne, you know, all the people who used to know him. And all of them seemed pretty clear and said, you know, the best way to think of this is that he is a casualty of the war. Like, you know, he came home 3 years ago, but the war is what killed him. So I definitely wanted to talk about that.
Talking about media, then Damon Runyon brought this up, and you kind of alluded to this too, that had it not been for the media coverage of the fact that these guys were lost, nobody would have gotten them out, but everybody knew about the Lost Battalion and were rooting for them. So the media, in a sense, helped them. I found that real interesting. And the media even 100 years ago.
Yeah. And I'm glad you latched onto that. I had a ton of fun, obviously, like Damon Runyon, you know, what a figure.
Yeah.
But I was in my research struck by that, you know, by how, you know, the value of life in war gets calculated so coldly. And, you know, I think absolutely, had the media not been covering them, the Army would have been much more comfortable just saying, well, you know, people die. But because of that, they had to sort of save them. And then that, of course, led to, once they saved them, all this, you know, the parades, the movie, you know, just the constant speaking engagement. So it was really like a double-edged sword. Like, the media kind of saved his life and then kind of also helped take his life.
Okay, I'll be quiet for a while. You have a whole lot of comments on the chat here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Bill Savage says Civil War veterans were said to have soldier's heart. That's a good phrase. Gwen, Major Whittlesey sobbed at night. Yeah, I think that, and that was something that really struck me too in my research. And I think, you know, one of the things that caused me to create the character of Bill Cavanaugh is that, in addition to crying at night, like, because Whittlesey was so famous for being cool, you know, he didn't duck when he was shot at, he walked tall, he was very calm, everyone was impressed by how serene he was. But of course, a lot of times when we're under trauma, we think we're fine, and it's finding its way out in other ways that we might not be aware of. And that was the way he let it out. You know, his second in command, George McMurtry, was like, you know, wake up, you're crying, you have to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And then also he did spend a night where a wounded soldier was in his bunk hole with him, and that soldier died in the morning. You know, by the morning he was dead. And so I didn't know for sure that that was Bill Cavanaugh, but I thought, what if it was Bill Cavanaugh, to kind of really just make, you know, because I think the thing about violence and the thing about war is like trying to find a way to write about it that's not just like a statistic or not just expected. So to really put a face to that specific loss.
Your writing is so poetic. I didn't remember that you were a poet when I was reading the prose, but that explains how you turn a phrase. Oh my goodness. I have something written down that I enjoyed so much. And is it your original thought? I just loved it. This was Cher Amit saying this. I've learned that everything that thinks and feels grows by subtraction. Detachment brings perspective. Wisdom comes from letting go.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, that was, as far, I mean, it's hard to know, like original is tricky. I mean, everything comes from somewhere, but yeah, I think the thing that made me think of that was, you know, very literally about her lost leg, you know, and just the things, you know, that I meant it to be metaphorical, of course, and emotional, but just like she herself kind of became the sculpture, this taxidermy. And then you have the scene, you know, where she's talking to Baby Mine, her love interest, and, you know, is kind of embarrassed by how she looks now. And Baby Mine has to be like, yeah, you know, you look pretty bad. Like you look like you've been through war. You know, and just thinking of how like the physical and the metaphysical, you know, growth is loss, I guess. You know, you can't learn or change without letting some stuff go.
I just had to write that phrase down. It was so beautiful.
Thank you. I love it. I always tell my students to write stuff down. So when people write, I do that all the time in my books. So like, I love it. Thank you.
It was a library book. Otherwise I would have had it all marked up.
That's good. You're a good citizen. I appreciate that.
The librarians are going,
Buy one now.
Nice. Oh, it looks like, so Marcel says, on the north side of Chicago in Portage Park is the National Veterans Art Museum. If you go there, you will see artwork from veterans from several wars. Yeah, and you can see the horror of war in their work. Yeah, I've been there once. I teach at DePaul, and we have the Big Shoulders imprint, like the publishing imprint, where they teach students how to do publishing. And they did a collection of like veterans remembering their various conflicts. And one of the release events was there, which was a very appropriate setting for that. And Bill Savage says, buy the book. I appreciate that. And yeah, we're coming to the end of the hour. I don't want to cut it short, but I do want to say if people want to ask any final questions, and also just to say again, thank you so much to the book club, and thanks so much to the library, and also thanks so much to Bookies. And I think hopefully buy the book. Of course, I want you to buy my book, but I also as much want to say just like support your independent bookstores too. They're struggling, and you know, if you don't buy my book, buy somebody else's book.
Can I ask you one question too? I wanted to, well, two things. What you're working on now and what you're reading now.
Yes. So what I am working on now is, like I said, I literally just talked to my agent yesterday, and she has just read a draft of this silent movie star novel. So I am,
Right, you said it.
she gave me great edits, so I'm doing that, and it's really, really fun. So I'm working on that. And then what I'm reading, I just read, and this is maybe for something I'll read. I've always wanted to write a Western, and so that would be years from now, but I love that topic. So I just read Evan S. Connell, his book, Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn. I don't know if people have read it, but it is so good. They made it into a movie in the early 90s. I mean, it came out in 1984. I haven't seen the movie. I hear it's not that good, but the book is like, mwah, chef's kiss. It's remarkable. It's just like everything I want nonfiction to be. And, you know, I was honestly not sure what to expect because it's from 1984. And so our, you know, ideas of, you know, how to talk about Native Americans and how to talk about the West and stuff are always evolving. And so I wasn't sure how it would hold up, but it's so good. It's so respectful and so thoughtful. And you just learn so much. Everyone in it is presented as like a three-dimensional warts and all person. You know, he avoids romanticizing anyone. He avoids damning anyone. And it's super sad and super great.
Thank you.
Okay. And then on behalf of the book club, again, we thank you and thank you for answering all of our questions. And does anybody have a last question? No. Okay.
All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your night. Bye, friends.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Kathleen,
Wonderful.
Yeah, bye, Bill Savage. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
watch your mail.
Okay, I will.
Okay. Thank you again, Kathleen. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. I'll sign off, but this was awesome. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Take care.
Great job, Julie.
Oh, hey, Helen. how-
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I did too. I did too. Yeah.
Great to see everybody on.
Yes.
Okay.
He was delightful.
I think I need to join this book club.
Next month, we're reading The Vanishing Half.
The Vanishing Half, HALF.
Yes,
That's right. And there are
Okay.
copies in the library if you'd like to join us. And we meet the last Wednesday of the month. That's my commercial.
are we really are we
Okay.
meeting in the library?
Pardon?
No, I don't think so. Oh, no, we're probably still going to be Zoom, right, Julie?
We're gonna be Zoom for a little while, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Maybe in the summer we
The
can.
books are in the library is what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Got it.
I just
Okay.
wasn't sure if we were coming back to in-person.
I know.
discussion.
Maybe we could meet outside sometime.
I know it's
There you go.
summertime.
There you go.
Yeah.
You know, in the summertime, Julie, we could meet on the parking lot.
Right. Didn't we do that once? I think Nikki did once, right by the butterfly garden.
Yeah, we did the book about the butterflies. We were outside. That was nice.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right. Take
All
care.
right. Thanks, ladies.
Bye-bye,
Good night.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
I'm gonna
Bye.
end it. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.